Okay, we're going to the tissue level of organization. And in this brief lecture, we'll talk about tissues, glands, and membranes. You should be able to define the term tissue, talk about the four basic types of tissue, what they're like, and where you'd find them, describe the process of inflammation and tissue repair, and then have a little bit to say about cancer. So tissues are basically just groups of cells that are similar in appearance and share a similar function. And so our body is really organized into tissues, and then tissues are organized into organs. And so these are groups of similar cells. Okay, and there's over 200 types of tissue, specific types. And actually more are being discovered each day, because as we can learn more about them genetically and chemically, we find that some tissues that look alike are actually different. But all tissues can be grouped into four basic types. So I have here the Fantastic Four, and that the Silver Surfer guy you have to kind of ignore. But the basic types of tissues are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. And so these are the tissues that we will get to know, and I'll talk about some features of each and show you an example or a couple of each type. So epithelial tissues are also just called epithelia. Okay, and these are the tissues that are found on external and internal body surfaces. So when you look at, I think it's Jessica Alba there of the Fantastic Four, everything you see is epithelium. Okay, and so she has nice epithelia. Okay, these are tissues on internal surfaces, external surfaces, and they form the active part of glands. They have cells that are anchored together by desmones, and these cells are very close together, anchored to one another with almost nothing in between, no blood vessels, no protein fibers or anything. And then the cells are anchored to underlying tissue by what's called a basement membrane, and that does contain some secreted material. And so on one side you have this basement membrane, and on the other side is just space. Okay, and you find epithelial tissues obviously on surfaces, so they're protecting underlying tissues. But they also do things like secrete materials, they excrete waste products, they absorb nutrients. They can be fairly active tissues, and they tend to have cells that reproduce and replace themselves, so they heal well. They're a common tissue type, one of the most important tissue types. Here's a picture of epithelial tissues. There's on the left there is a cartoon drawing of an epithelial tissue that has a single layer of flat cells, like you would find on the surface of the lungs. It protects underlying tissue. There's a basement membrane kind of holding it down to connective tissue, and on the top there's nothing. Then on the right there are two views of this tissue. The upper view is a top view, kind of looking down. So it's like looking down on floor tiles. And then the bottom view is a side view. So you see these guys in cross sections. Okay, so this is a tissue that can protect underlying tissue. It's thin, but might be secreting things as well. The other really common thing to remember is all glands, the active part of the gland is an epithelial tissue. And these glands, they can be simple, like a simple tube, or they can be compound, or they can have little kind of grape-like clusters on the bottom. You have always epithelial tissue lining the active part of this. And these things, sometimes they'll secrete material by just kind of squirting it out, but other time they'll give off parts or maybe even whole cells. So epithelial tissues are common. We have them in many, many places. Okay, connective tissues are a big group of tissues that have relatively few cells kind of far apart, and what lies between the cells are something called a ground substance or a matrix. It's a fluid or protein fibers or sometimes even a solid or semi-solid material, and that's what actually does the job, is this matrix or ground substance. So it forms structures like bones or cartilage. It stores things like in fat tissue or in what's called adipose. They also form strong connections like tendons and ligaments. And liquid tissues like blood that transport things, those are connective tissues. These tissues, again, fewer cells, lots of extracellular material. They're less active. They're often resting as an adult and don't really get active until there's some sort of injury. They look very different. It's quite diverse. And so here you see some examples of connective tissues. And these connective tissues, probably the best one I would like you to look at is on the upper right there. It says areolar connective tissue. And you can see the scattered cells there where it says nucleus. And then there are two types of like fibers in there. There are these pink fibers that are collagen, that are very strong. And then there's black fibers that are kind of thin and kinky, and those are elastic fibers. And so that's typical of a connective tissue. Okay, the next type of tissue is a muscle tissues. These tissues have cells that contract, and they contain proteins actin and myosin that can slide past each other to produce the force needed to contract. These guys will produce movement of the whole body or movement of fluids within the body or movement of things in the digestive tract, stuff like that. They also produce a lot of heat. These cells use tons of energy, but once again, they're not that great at healing. Like epithelial tissues heal well. Not all the connective tissues heal well, and muscle tissues are even worse. When they're injured, they don't heal well at all. Okay, and so muscle tissues tend to have elongate cells, and in some cases, you can actually see the bands of the proteins that are causing the contraction. And these are the striations you see in the two types of tissue on the left there, the skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle, which is found in organs, that has the actin and myosin, the two proteins, in very irregular patterns, so you can't see the striations. Okay, the last major group of tissues are the nerve tissues. These all contain cells called neurons, and these neurons can receive messages and generate action potentials, which are kind of the way they send a message. And they are long-lived, very large cells that, again, don't heal well but are quite active. Okay, there's a picture of a neuron on the left there. Has a very large cell body and then extensions that project away from the cell called dendrites or axons. And those projections may go several feet. They're thin but long. There are other cells in these tissues, but these cells are called neuroglial cells, and they're supportive in nature. They do a variety of things that assist the neurons, but they actually don't send and receive messages. Okay, so we have these four basic tissue types. And typically, they are going to be what produce organs. And so organs contain two or more types of tissues. And these, you think, well, how are they arranged? Well, usually they're just arranged in layers. And the simplest organs are referred to as membranes. Membranes have usually just two layers of tissue. This here is a picture of a tube that's lined by a mucous membrane. And you can see what's called a goblet cell there about halfway down in that mucous membrane that secretes the mucus. And there's this white area here, that's the free surface. So the layer of cells with all these nuclei that's midway through, that's the epithelium, and then below that is connective tissue. And so membranes are simple organs. More complex organs might have 3 or 4 layers, and often these wrap around to form a tubular structure. Okay, when we talk about tissues, we can also talk about a response that occurs at the level of the tissue. And when tissues are damaged, a typical response is something called inflammation, which we've all heard the term, but now we're going to know it a little more specifically. In inflammation, damaged tissues, the damaged cells release a chemical. Often it's histamine, and this chemical is what triggers inflammation. And inflammation itself is an increased flow of blood in the area. The blood vessels dilate. It's called vasodilation, so more blood flows into that area. The blood vessels also leak So the tissue swells, it becomes edemaed or edematous, and this leakage of fluid causes it to become reddened and swollen and hot, and then you get the migration of nerve cells in there. So this is what causes inflammation. The typical symptoms are pain, swelling, redness, heat, and it may cause fever. You may get loss of function. And this is typical after an injury. Like after you get a splinter, this shows a splinter entering the skin. The damaged cells will release histamine, and that will cause blood flow in the area to increase. The blood vessels will leak out fluid, and also kind of leaving the blood vessels will be immune cells, and they can then fight infection. And this is the first step in healing, is getting these cells and materials to the site of an injury. Okay, another type of tissue level kind of response is cancer. We've talked about cancer as cells that are reproducing too often, where you have uncontrolled cell division. But we see this as a change in the tissue, that some of the cells not only are reproducing more, they'll change their behavior, they'll change their appearance. They won't have the orderly appearance that we expect in a normal tissue. They may break off and travel in blood vessels. That's called metastasis. And you have altered activities. They may set up a large growth that attracts new blood vessels. That's angiogenesis. So we can recognize these changes in the tissues. And so that's an often tissues we can recognize, or cancers we can recognize what tissue that they came from. Okay, so to summarize, tissues are groups of cells that have similar shape and function. There are 4 basic types of tissue: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nerve tissue. Epithelial tissues line body surfaces inside and out. They form glands. They contain 1 or more layers of closely packed cells. Connective tissues have abundant matrix secreted by relatively few cells. The material may be a fluid, it might be protein, or a solid. Muscle tissues contract. The cells contract to produce movement. Nerve tissues receive signals and produce action potentials. Tissue injury, often the most common response is inflammation. That's vasodilation, edema, and immune activation. And uncontrolled cell division, which we call cancer, changes and injures tissues. Okay, try for this section, don't focus on naming individual tissues. Know the general features of each of the general types. Know inflammation and cancer. Okay,